إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
Professor Anwar, thank you again for coming and for taking time out. I know it's very late your time. We are going to do this in two parts. I will start with some questions for you, and maybe we'll do it for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions to colleagues. If I can please ask everybody to mute their Zoom.
Tolong dibikin.
Could I ask everyone to mute, please? Thank you. Oh, looks like we got someone.
Yes, it sounds Indonesian.
Sami, if you could mute our colleague as well if you can't hear. Can you do that?
Huh?
Yes.
Sami, are you there? Lost.
Yeah, I'm just trying to mute. Yeah.
So it's Habib, Shazina,
Yeah.
and I think and Ghazali Abafira.
Very interruption.
Yes, that's right. If everybody can please mute their Zoom, please.
I think I've managed to.
Or maybe Sami, you could mute everyone. Can you mute everyone except
Yeah.
myself and Professor Anwar?
Okay, that's
How's that?
better, I think.
Good. Okay, Professor Anwar, you can hear us?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. Brilliant. Okay, well, let's get started. So, you were born in 1947 on August the 10th. And I was looking at, a little bit of Malaysian history, of which I think, like a lot of us, I know very little. But I noticed that it became independent from Britain in 1963. So you had
1957 was independence, but then the formation of Malaysia was 1963.
Was 63, but the
Yes.
actual independence was 57.
Yes.
So, which means that you spent some time under British rule. To talk us through your memories of those early years. What was it like?
Well, my childhood, this is before I was about 10, there was a time of the huge battle between the British Army and British forces against the communist insurgents. It was not a very comfortable period. That weakens the resolve of the British. That is why.
I'm so sorry. We're just going to stop for a sec. Samia, can you mute? Is it possible to mute everybody?
Sorry, yes, no, as people are entering, I'm just meeting everyone, yeah.
Oh,
Can find the co-host Scott and me, I can help you to view.
Right.
That's not a bad idea.
Can you do that, Samia?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Everybody muted now? I might just pause letting people in. I think I'll do that.
I think so too. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that because otherwise.
Okay, so Ehsan and Anwar, I think you just need to. You might need to constantly unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm muted. Professor Anwar, and you're unmuted. Okay. So let's go again. I think we can go this time hopefully without interruption. So yes, you were talking about your early memories of being in Malaysia under British rule.
Well, there was early 50s and a period of the communist insurgents, militant communist activities against the British Raj. So I think not really comfortable, but there was this wave I can see from the activities of my parents and family members and the villagers all gearing up for independence. That was the only period I could realize, and then to understand that this is a declaration of independence from British rule, that we'll get independence and all the nice exhortations and promises for the bright future of the golden age of Malaysia.
And were you from a family where there was involvement in political affairs, against empire and colonization?
Yeah, my parents were very active in the United Malay National Organisation, UMNO, those days, Nationalist Party, and I followed them in some of the activities and the programs into these deep villages, and really listening to them talking about why we need to unite and force the British out.
Mm-hmm. And so you said that 1957 was independence, and then it took another 6 years for Malaysia to be created. So why was there this gap?
Well, there was this independence of the entity then known as Malaya, the federated, the Malay states, the peninsula. Then later on, there were negotiations with Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak, the two provinces in Borneo. And there were even initial discussions with Brunei, but didn't fall through for a number of reasons. But then when Malaysia was formed, it included Singapore, Sabah and Sarawak.
And then how did Singapore then become separate?
Well, there were strong dissension between Singapore politicians led by State Premier Lee Kuan Yew then, and the then Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman on the need to forge national unity, what entity, Malaysian entity or Malay dominance. There were serious concerns, and the Malays then, according to Tunku Abdul Rahman, did not feel secure with the more aggressive tone of the Singapore leadership. So Tunku Abdul Rahman, on his own volition, no discussion as always, just decided to part and decided to say and came up with a resolution approved by Parliament that Singapore should stay out and be given separate independence by the British, which is rare actually throughout history to have this sort of a unique experience as we have seen in Malaysia. But we went on peacefully, and we maintained good, cordial bilateral relations with Singapore.
Mm-hmm. And can you say something from just from your memory of the time with your parents? What were the attitudes, and what were people talking about in relation to Britain and its role, and of course from what you learned later during that independence period? Because for a lot of the other nations that went through colonization and decolonization, it's a very mixed legacy, but generally speaking, a very negative one.
There was actually a very strong progressive semi-left force within the country, but my family and most other conservative Malays were more associated with the UMNO, and the British then found it more convenient to work with UMNO because then they saw some of the issues could be resolved amicably with the British. And so my understanding those days only related to the more conservative elements within the nationalist struggle. But even then I could sense the strong resentment against British rule, against British dominance, that in education, public health, political rights, we were deprived, and the British did actually very little to assist the majority of the Malaysians. But there was also a racial connotation to that the Malays were in the majority felt that the British have somewhat marginalized and ignored them in terms of education and trade and business. So those were the sense that I could gather from my experience as a child, looking at the initial development and change within the country.
So you follow in your parents' footsteps in a way, and you become part of UMNO, but you're also very active in various youth movements, and of course, and this is the period, when Pan-Islamism, along with Pan-Africanism and so many of these other sort of anti-colonial kind of unity movements is becoming a really important part of the polity of the global South. So talk us through, what was happening and what were you thinking and why were you making some of the decisions that you were doing at the time?
Ehsan, yes, I grew up under this conservative UMNO dominion, but then as you see, the moment I entered the university, my thought process changed somewhat. I was more involved with broader progressive Muslim youth activities and Muslim work, and very strong position vis-a-vis the colonial past, and started talking about the meaning and essence of independence. We were promised independence, we were promised good governance, and rid the country of corruption and abuse of power, and I could sense that the same issues that we fought against the British have crept into the system. And of course, those days were the days where we were familiar with the works of Frantz Fanon and Ivan Illich and Herbert Marcuse. And you can sense the attempt to understand and appreciate the need for change and true meaning of independence against rampant corruption and abuse of power. And later, of course, we formed the Muslim Youth Movement, and good exposure with the Middle East, with the Indian, Pakistani subcontinent, and Indonesia. And incidentally, we had a great conference this morning on Muhammad Nasser, the pivotal reformist figure in Indonesia, and we were quite impressed by the Indonesian experience, more inclusive, more tolerant, and not as rancorous, the exchange between the so-called nationalists or Islamists or the leftists, initially until the emergence of the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. In Malaysia, things are more, I should say, softer, inclusive. For example, our relations with the left and the right in the university, and even when I was in ABIM, were more cordial and not that rancorous. I think I learned from the radicalism, Ehsan, the radicalism only from your friends in the UK and the Middle East. When I was exposed to Zia and the group, they became a bit slightly more progressive and radical, I think.
Talking of the different Islamic parties, so of course, I've never properly understood how did obviously there was a strong tradition of kind of religiously inspired thought within UMNO, and of course you were very much a part of that. You were leading that. How did then PAS emerge, the Islamic Party of Malaysia, which was a much more avowedly Islamic organization? Where did this come from?
The PAS started off as a splinter from UMNO. It became an ulama session, committee of the UMNO, who had strong reservations against the perceived secular liberal UMNO policies. But then it emerged as strongly Islamic and nationalist at the same time. So the initial rhetoric and narrative of PAS was education, Malay education, and not too much of the narrow Sharia legalistic view. That was the past. I'm not talking about the present. The present, they have emerged to become really ultra or neo-conservative in a sense.
But they weren't that in the beginning, then you're saying?
They weren't, because some of the initial leaders were known great progressive Islamists and nationalists at the same time, who were successful engaging with the left and some of the other non-Muslim progressive forces in the country. That attracted even me when I was young, though not associated with the Islamic Party, but was attracted to some of their views and thought process, precisely because of their more tolerant and accommodative position.
And so, is it the case that within UMNO itself, what did the splintering of PAS do to UMNO? Did it, what was the impact of that? Did the organisation feel it needed to become more Islamic, or was the idea, well, actually, we've lost, this was a tradition that we didn't need, and so we can become, maybe move in a different direction? What was the impact on UMNO?
No, unlike some of the other developments in other Muslim countries, in Malaysia, what happened was that UMNO were the popular choice among the Malays, and because of their ability to work with the non-Malays, the Chinese and the Indians in Malaya, and then the indigenous Sabahans and Sarawakians, they were very dominant and very strong, and to a large extent past was marginalized, and finally they were able only to emerge and have a foothold in the state of Kelantan, where 95 or 98% were Muslims. So my entry in 82, after leaving the Muslim Youth ABIM, Muslim Youth Organisation, was with this clear agenda of reform, anti-corruption drive, and also inculcation of Islamic values and ethics into the administration, which was controversial to some very liberal element of society. They thought that Anwar was responsible in Islamizing. But I think my thesis then was to inculcate an understanding. Of course, it's inclusive, but at the same time very strong on governance, because I think from those days, I thought the major deficit in Muslim countries and societies is issue of governance and the commitment to justice, principle of justice. So there is a clear, disconnect between what is the exalted, the exaltations about Islamic state or Islamic ethics, but certainly there lies the shadow between what was said, what was practiced. And that was my attempt through, of course, institutions, the bank or the Islamic universities, on infusion of Islamic values, which was not easy because Malaysia is a multiracial, multi-religious country.
I definitely want to come back to that in a sec. Just kind of running through the sort of the chronology of your career. I'm very interested in the period that you were Minister of Finance and also Deputy Prime Minister. And of course, it was fascinating for us. I mean, I was a much younger person then, but I do remember it was quite extraordinary watching, again, somebody with a sort of a strong commitment to ideas and to research and to thinking, occupying a role which often isn't occupied by people with those skills. But of course, you were operating very much within the Washington Consensus, or what's called the Washington Consensus, and the particular ideas around what is often called neoliberal economics. Can you tell us about some of the sort of challenges and the opportunities at that time that you had?
Before the Ehsan, I know it's Ramadan Kareem, can I be excused? We are here at 10:30 at night, so I should be allowed to have a seat.
No, please do.
Now, yes, we were operating somewhat, I inherit as a finance minister, essentially a capitalistic framework. In fact, to an extent, unbridled capitalism. And but then I realized there were limitations, of course. You remember those days, the World Bank came out with a fantastic report of the East Asian Economic Miracle, which I then, as chairman of the Development Committee of the World Bank and IMF, spoke in front of Michelle Kamdeso, the IMF, and Wolfenson, the bank chief, to say that you are doing this and the end result will be leaders, finance ministers and prime ministers will lull into complacency, assuming that things are all right. We still have abject poverty. We still have areas that have been marginalized. We have still a problem of corruption. So it's okay to recognize that growth was impressive, 9-10%. But then it depends on what we do. What about public housing? What about public health? What about education? What about the abject poor? So I think, although I do accept the fact that we were navigating in a very murky areas, waters about Washington consensus, etc. But we never subscribed to that fully because, for example, I would say that our allocation for education, health, those days, and public housing surpassed that of allocation for defense, which most Muslim countries, Africa or Asia or Latin America, particularly, or developing countries, suffered because of the over emphasis on the need to disburse funds for defense. So they were, and even in my lectures and speeches, I always make it a point. All right, you talk about wealth of nations, but you must not ignore the theory of moral sentiment. There were some real issues of concern, issues of inequality, of injustice, of poverty, and through that capacity, because from a small deficit to a balanced budget to a surplus, I was conservative in that sense, because at the time when we had this plenty of resources and abundance, I did caution in my budget speech about the 7 years of plenty to prepare for the 7 years of economic hardships, using the experience and the teachings of Yusuf alayhi salam or Joseph in the Bible. And I did say it in the speeches. So although we were somewhat criticized for being too soft in our at least attitude on negotiations with the IMF, the World Bank, but mind you, contrary to the perception or the criticism against me, I stopped any accepting any loan from the World Bank from 93. Mind you, Ehsan, 93 I stopped. You know why? Because I think we had the capacity and we should not be dependent on them. But and I was, of course, imprisoned in 1998, and in 1999 the leaders that condemned me for being a lackey of the West of the Washington Consensus then went to the World Bank and asked for funds. I didn't know that. Nobody knew. It was all kept in secret until when I was teaching at Georgetown. I served a short spin of time as consultant to the World Bank, some of the issues on governance and anti-corruption. Then I looked at the files, and to my horror, I realized those guys were cheating us, saying that we are against Washington consensus in the World Bank, and quietly they asked for funds and borrowed from the World Bank. I mean, it's an example. But I think to your point about my position vis-a-vis the neoliberal concept is clear. It does not take Piketty's inequality. Long before, we have been saying. And if you look at the surplus that we had in the 1990s, the largest public housing program, particularly for the poor, urban poor, were conducted when I was Minister of Finance. The huge resources for new universities were in that period too. And of course, the major resources disbursed for rural infrastructure and poverty eradication. Some measure of success.
So this, I mean, we're all seeing how the Biden administration is now talking, some of that language of those debates in the 1970s and 80s before the more neoliberal ideas sort of came in. When you look at this and when you hear speeches and you read some of the policy documents, what does that make you think? That these ideas are not new ideas that are now being imbibed, or did it need some of the catastrophes of the last 4 decades for people like Piketty and then now in the new American administration to begin to challenge some of those earlier ideas?
I certainly welcome some of the economic prescriptions by Biden, and I think it's quite reassuring coming after Donald Trump. But as you said, this is something that we have been talking about. There have been lots of criticisms against the US position vis-a-vis the economic policies and using the international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, to force and compel countries to subscribe to the policies like the Washington Consensus. But you know, I make a difference, Ehsan. I think I need to clarify this. I sometimes even use Washington Consensus and World Bank in terms of forcing countries, including Malaysia, to accept the issue of good governance and transparency. You see, so that part I normally would highlight because it would help us with a strong dose of support from the international institutions. But notwithstanding that, there were lots of differences, and as you've seen, as you see in America, even then they have real difficulty. It's appalling how a country like United States could still continue to debate harshly and in a state of complete denial about the issue of gross inequality. To me, which is shameful. It reflects clearly the failure of governance. I remember, I think it's interesting, novel by Gore Vidal, Armageddon, and other essays, and which gives us a rebuke against this sort of excesses and the fallacy of and the failure of political leaders to grasp the problems encountered by the general masses.
Let's, Professor Ibrahim, let's go back into the Islamic world now. And of course, Malaysia in the 90s, in your time in government, was perhaps a very important part of the OIC, the organization of what was then the Organization of Islamic Conference, now the Organization of Islamic Countries, and an organization with great potential. What are your thoughts about the promise of the OIC then and the reality of what it is today?
You have initiatives like the D8 of Muslim countries and OIC, in terms of focusing on some issues that has not been dealt with by other international bodies or regional bodies, is fair. But I don't think we should give too much a priority, because for Malaysia, as a small country, we need to ensure that the relations, the priority is good, effective diplomatic and trade relations with our neighbors, ASEAN. Then, of course, moving on to China, India, Australia. Then maintaining good relations with the West, Australia, United States of America, Canada, and in Europe. And Muslim countries, we should continue, because there are certain issues which may affect the interests of general Muslims. But I think, to be realistic, we have to put the issue of legitimacy of these countries, political legitimacy, and issue of good governance in place before we could effectively engage and benefit from each other's experience.
From the history that I've read, and from the conversations that I've had with Gio and Meryl and with so many others, my understanding was that in that time that of the 1980s and 90s, your ambition, the idea was to bring thinking into the OIC system, whether it's through conferences and seminars, or through think tanks, or through research publishing. How successful do you feel you were in that objective? It is to, with all the constraints, of governments that may not be legitimate, or dictatorships, or monarchies. How successful do you feel you were now, looking back on that time?
Frankly, we should give some credit. There were some concerns and measures of support by the international community, but then they were very apprehensive when it comes to anything that any reference to issue of justice or freedom or democracy. But when it comes to technology or development of science, fair. There was some initial support, although I think you look at the issues and the rate of success at present, certainly there has not been the focus. The last few years you have hardly heard any voice or bold initiative by the OIC. And I think we need to also engage to make sure, if it has any relevance, it must continue to propose or initiate some of the meaningful programs in IT, for example, in the areas of initial reforms in these Muslim countries, or at least education. There should be major focus. Of course, they had the ISESCO set up. Some work has been done, but then, you know, looking at the huge capacity and the resources, very, very unfortunate, because the results has been very minimal.
But at the time, I mean, I understand and somewhat recollect that Malaysia, under yourself and under Mahathir, you know, there was a real effort to introduce, you know, more thinking into the institutions of the OIC. Even at that time, do you feel you had some success?
I should say some relative success. I can't use the word success. I mean, there's some measure of small progress, I suppose, to be fair. So I finally decided at that time to focus on Malaysia and on friendly countries and region on a bilateral or multilateral basis, instead of using these huge multinational or multi-regional organizations like the OIC. So what we did was, of course, to have, Zia is of course very much involved in this too, to have a series of seminars, training, and bring in Ali Mazrui, and even managing, I was attempting to get even Edward Said. Unfortunately, he was taken ill at that time. And then the rest, of course, from all denominations, all orientations, to get, I think, creative thought into the process. Because that is, to my mind, what is quite or terribly lacking in the Muslim world.
Well, and just on that, so you're also one of the founders of another, you know, transnational organization, the International Institute for Islamic Thought, IIIT, you know, which has gone through, you know, like many organizations, including, of course, the Muslim Institute, it's gone through, you know, many phases. Where do you see IIIT now in terms of talking about a knowledge renaissance or trying to build the capacity to be able to think and to do research within an Islamic context?
You know, when Almarhum Ismail Farouqi initiated this idea of International Institute of Islamic Thought, look at the Malays of the Ummah, the focus, of course, in education, they're realizing there's a complete disconnect between modern education and Islamic education, and therefore they use the term Islamization, which was quite controversial, but still I thought, given the relative success of people, at least the relevance of economics or anthropology or sociology or social sciences in the Islamic framework, it was certainly, to my mind, a major breakthrough or tour de force in terms of the Muslim thought. But then there was an awareness too, and I think with Zia Jamal Bazanji, we took that initiative with Anas in London, and Zia then crafted, after a series of meetings, that we should then progress from Islamization of knowledge to integration of knowledge, which I think is the appropriate term, with a strong awareness in terms of the ethical dimension of Islam, in terms of our faith, our moral values and cultural fortitude. But at the same time, we realize that the theme should be integration of knowledge, and there was a paper that unfortunately I was in prison again at that time, so Zia presented in Istanbul, and I think it was it is now the new direction of the IIIT.
Well, so let's go back a little bit. In fact, you've sort of prompted my kind of next few questions, which is, you're probably maybe the most, if not one of the most famous political prisoners anywhere in the world, not only in the Islamic world or in Asia, but I think anywhere in the world. And you know, you've had a sort of remarkable and, quite frankly, a very tragic series of experiences. And each time you have bounced back. Without necessarily going into the sort of the finer details of what happened, there was one question, I suppose, that has always, I think, struck me and many of us who read and follow these things, is that you then went back into government with the one person who was perhaps responsible for your torment. How must have that been for you?
Yeah, the answer should be either you are naive or you or desperate. Many of my friends criticized me ferocious or severe against me for the decision. But look at the context. I was in prison, okay? And my colleagues, not only within the Justice Party, but also the friendly coalition partners have been there with me for the last 20 over years, and decided that, look, now that Tun Mahathir wants to be amongst us, and he has somewhat subscribed to the ideas of reform. Of course, I can be very cynical, because we are talking about a major systemic problem of corruption, of poor governance, of the judiciary becoming complicit in many of the decisions or apparatus for the ruling clique, and Mahathir was instrumental. But then he insisted and came to see me when I was in prison. I said, Anwar, we'll have to work together. We have to save the country from corruption, from mismanagement, from poor governance. And I will be there for a short span of time, then you will be able to take over. Was I convinced? No. I always make reference to the leopard and the serpent. But my colleagues thought that, look, Anwar, in your absence is probably reasonable. So I say, okay, we should be able to be more compassionate and forgiving. فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ. Then, there's also a Quranic reminder on that. So I said, fair. So we move on. And then the government was formed, and unfortunately, some of the excesses of the past came back within this new system. I became a bit more political, albeit more polite, because I can't afford to cause too much dissension within the ruling coalition. After that, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. So that precisely what happened. And now we're back in the opposition. And my decision was to proceed with a clear reform agenda, with us in charge, not necessarily anymore with Mahathir.
And just, in terms of your relationship with Mahathir, how is that now? Given everything that's happened.
Malice towards none, easier said than none. I think we'll move on. I consider him quite obsolete in his ideas. He's been given a fair chance, second time around, quite a unique experience in metapolitical and world affairs. And so we have to move on. I don't think we need to be too preoccupied about what should we do with him. I think he represents a small party of 4 members of parliament, and we can engage, because as leader of the opposition, I have 2 roles. One is, of course, leader of the coalition, which actually incidentally is the largest political bloc in the country. Second, my role as leader of the opposition. So I have to engage with everyone, including Mahathir's party. And that, of course, I will do. This is part of the responsibility of the opposition leader.
Let's go to the virus, which is, in a way, partly the reason we're all here. Again, I'll encourage everyone to read your essay, which has a lot of reflection around COVID, but also notions of justice. And it's a very interesting reflection of a lot of your experiences do really come into this. So for those of us who are sitting in the countries of Europe or in the United States, of course, this has been a an absolutely terrible pandemic, and it remains a terrible pandemic. But for the countries in your region, they have managed it much more competently. We have been very incompetent, and the countries of Asia and East Asia have been. We're not out of it yet, of course. We're still, cases are rising exponentially on a global level. Why do you think that Europe and the United States have been so incompetent, but East Asia has been so much more competent?
Well, East Asia, some exceptions, some countries, the rest are really in a horrible state. There were some, of course, regard for the fact that we were somewhat relatively successful earlier on, but due to the lack of transparency, we don't know when the vaccines are arriving, how much is being ordered, how many are going to be vaccinated, and particularly the general masses, the urban poor, the rural poor, the heartland, when it's going to get when they are going to get vaccinated. So I don't think it is quite correct to say that, although I do recognize the initial period we were a bit probably deemed to be quite effective, but now as people see it, it's a complete rotten failure. The direction of duty, of responsibility, there is a clear incompetence in the way we make decisions and place orders, and the plan to vaccinate our people. Now, how do you then address?
What is the situation with vaccination in Malaysia? How far have you got? And
the process is so slow that if the rate that we are doing it now, will be another 2-3 years before we can complete, and there is no certainty when the vaccines are arriving. I mean, second phase. I had people. You see, first the frontliners, then the members of parliament, the VVIPs were all given Pfizer initially, and then nothing is known about the next course of action, when the vaccines are arriving. There's no certainty, no information. Okay, the minister will come out and say, well, we are expected to complete by the end of the year. I mean, you look at the 25,000 or so every day, then it will take years to complete the process. And because they have declared a state of emergency, yours is not to question why. But of course, they give an example. For example, there was also relative failure in terms of the slow pace initially in the United States, and the problems now resurfacing in the UK and in Europe. Okay, we can always compare to the worst, but I think we should be more specific. When do we order the vaccines? What is the cost of the vaccines? When are we able to ensure that the public at large will be given these vaccines? I mean, these are issues that we can address, because to a large extent, even in terms of numbers, Indonesia, for example, has surpassed us and been more successful in this regard. Of course, they are dealing with a larger population.
I just read the other day that one of the reasons why vaccination is progressing so slowly in most of the world is because the suppliers are mostly in the European Union and the United States. That's mostly where the R&D is done, and even there are agreements like the COVAX agreement, but in fact these agreements don't mean anything in a pandemic, because countries are putting export bans and they are vaccinating their own populations. I'm just thinking again to the Malaysia that you were very much a part of the government of the 90s, which put so much emphasis on technology, both import substitution, but so many other ways of developing technology. Did you think, or is there a view that countries like Malaysia need to be now researching, developing and manufacturing their own vaccines?
Well, there's been some commendable progress by some of our universities, but they're not given enough support and impetus to support the venture. I mean, some people from the universities have talked to me and have discussed their research, some measure of success, but they always have this major problem with the institutions and the support from the government. And back to your, I think, earlier remark, Ehsan, about this notion about, to me, essentially, it's still justice. No, there's a poor notion of what good governance and justice is all about. I mean, you only care and secure the interests of the ruling elite and ruling clique, and the vast members, the people, the vast majority has somewhat being sidelined and ignored. You have a pandemic, they are still ignored. You have an relative economic success, they suffer. You have, of course, economic problems now with this massive unemployment, particularly among graduates, more so. And there is no concerted effort, no coherent policy to deal with that. That's why I say there's the dereliction of duty.
I've got a couple more questions, but I'm just going to take this opportunity to just pause for 20 seconds and ask colleagues who are on the call if you would like to put your questions in the chat box, and then I can read them out, and then maybe we can have a bit more of a discussion just for the second part of the of this event. Just looking to the future, Professor Anwar. Or actually, no, just a little bit before that, who would you say, in a way, a lot of your time, in a sense, during and before politics was a time of lots of thinking and activism, and you wrote, and there was a lot of material coming out, which was, extraordinarily interesting and inspiring, particularly for younger people then. Who are you now reading to be inspired? Who are the people that are inspiring you in Malaysia and elsewhere? What's on your, in other words, what's on your bookshelf?
Well, I take a more, I should say, open, I should say, tolerant view of these things. I don't confine myself to any particular school or particular leader. The nature of my work and interaction. Say the last few days I have to work more in terms of Indonesian political struggle and the role of Muhammad Natsir, because I had to deal with that subject this morning. So there's been a series of titles. And of course, for today, I'm going to go back to this Munyatul Musalli of Sheikh Dawood Fatani. This is a recent book published by University of Hawaii, Francis Bradley, Forging Islamic Power and Place. One of the rare work on Dawood Fatani that I actually was central in my thesis on justice for the praying person. Otherwise, what is there in the latest on the bookshelf? This is important. That I continue to be kept abreast. And of course, friends, difficult friends like Zia and Scott here will compel me to make sure that I keep abreast with the times, notwithstanding the pressure of work and my political activities. Of course, I'm sorry, Ehsan, I mean, in the last week or so, of course, reread Al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, particularly on the issue of his short chapter on fasting, and quite a lot of work and writings on that sort of practice, because when you interact with the Muslims in the mosque and some activities, I think we need to also impart some sort of new interpretation and meaning to fasting other than just not eating and drinking.
Okay, thank you. So I have one question that I'm going to read out. But if there are other questions, please start them coming in. So this is a question from one of the Muslim Institute Fellows, Amjad Hussain. And Amjad says there's a case of another famous Bristol prisoner, Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki from Nigeria. Do you know about his case?
Yes.
I'm afraid I'm not aware of this. I wonder if Amjad can come on the line and just tell us a bit more. You're still there. Oh, there you are, Amjad, yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself for a sec? Amjad, I think you're muted.
Yeah, can you hear me, Ehsan? And
We can hear you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, can Anwar hear me?
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Alaikum salam.
Obviously, we are aware of your predicament. You've been in and out of prison unjustly. You spent over a decade, and you're aware of our friend Ibrahim Naksaki. He's also been a victim of state oppression, and you are a father, and a husband. He's also a father and a husband, and unfortunately, there's been a series of massacres against his family and against his supporters. You're aware of the case, for instance, of the famous massacre that took place. It's notorious, in 2015, as well as in the Zaria massacre. And Anwar Ibrahim Zakzaki has lost 6 of his children to state oppression. They were shot. His house was raided in 2015. In which he lost his daughter. She was burnt alive, and the army shot his house, and one of the gas cylinders exploded, and she was burnt alive, and along with 3 of his sons. I know it's very difficult. Nigeria is very brutal power. I understand that you have limited political influence over it. But is there a chance you can raise this case to Mahathir government, and Malaysia can grant him political asylum, because he and his wife both are in prison since 2016, and although the case against him is really all made up, and even the High Court they have released, said that Maulana Ibrahim is not guilty of any crime and he should be set free, and the state is still holding him on flimsy charges.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am aware of the plight of Ibrahim Zaki, but I must apologize that we did not get any much details. If you could submit to us, I can get my committee to work on it, represent to the Nigerian embassy, and even to take it up to the Malaysian government and the Muhyiddin government now. Yeah, I'll take it up.
Yeah, please, I'll be quite happy to submit all the details.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Amjad, are there more questions? I certainly have a few more, but I'd like to give an opportunity to colleagues on the call.
Well, the last one is basically about him. I mean, he's been forever waiting to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia. I know, and because he wants to bring, obviously there is decadence in all governments and governments everywhere around the world, and he speaks of Islamic ethics and principles, and he's been unjustly, in prison and maybe not allowed to progress further into be in power, really. And what are his chances? He's been waiting forever to be the next Prime Minister.
We should always be optimistic. We should endeavor to do our best, but that's not everything. Okay, in order to strive in terms of achieving our goal in terms of political power, we must also educate the masses. We must also disseminate the correct information. It is a form of da'wah, and this has to continue. So I think, although I remain cautiously optimistic what's going to happen soon or in the next elections, I think more important is still the issue, realm of knowledge, programs, training programs, seminars that we continue to have. In the last week also we have a series of seminars, Zoom with hundreds and thousands of people all over the country and the region, and I think that should be a priority. People sometimes associate me only with political struggles. It's not entirely true, because I think to encourage reading and discussion and reason discourse is something which is important. Critical thinking is a must, and of course reading Critical Muslim.
We all do it. Thank you, Anwar.
Thanks again for that question, Amjad. While we have one coming, let me see if I can read it out. So one reason for the collapse of the previous government, the one that's just gone, were defections from your own party, Professor Anwar, including senior leaders from the Reformasi movement that you led in the 1990s. to what extent is the crisis of factions within the opposition something that could threaten its viability? It's a good question. Is there, how can the opposition hold?
Well, opposition in most developing countries have to face the issue of the institutions of governance. We came out with a strong statement that institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission becomes a political weapons being weaponized to intimidate opposition members. In fact, I went to see the MACC, Anti-Corruption Commission chiefs last fortnight or last month and present this case. Look, people are being intimidated. I am against corruption. It doesn't matter whether from which party, but how is it? Why is it? With so many reports against rampant corruption within the government, it's been largely ignored, and you start focusing and intimidating political forces. And once they join the government, the case is somewhat closed. They say, no, it's not closed, but somehow became silent. There's this magic formula. You are only corrupt when you don't support the government. The moment you support the government, you are now safe from being charged for corruption. And about the faction, yes, it's not something new. I concede. I probably partly my limitations. But what cannot be denied is that this orchestration are people who are just craving for power at all costs, and some very corrupt elements, even within our midst. Once they have the taste of power, and then they start amassing wealth, and of course they have problems with me. You know, I mean, I came up very strongly to say that we cannot tolerate our colleagues not only a matter of condoning corruption, but be blatantly corrupt and having extremely ostentatious lifestyles, which we cannot explain to the members of public. But then it's co-opted by the ruling party, and there you are, good riddance. But it wouldn't have happened, to my mind, if is somehow or rather not backed, or that Mahathir was not complicit to it in a way or other by encouraging these sort of factions, ignoring the fact that they are part of the main party.
Thank you for that. Another question that's just come in through the chat. This one's a long one, so I'm going to try and summarize it if I can, which is, it's really about it's a question and a comment about the role of the Malay communities within Malaysia and the preferences that they may have had before, the preferences they may still enjoy now, and what moves are there underway in order to create a sort of more level playing field for the other communities. I think that's the question, but it's from Moez Hayat, and I would just invite him if he's here, or if they're here to chime in. But in the meantime, Professor Ibrahim, what's your take on creating a sort of more level playing field for all of Malaysia's communities?
If you accept the Islamic notion of good governance and justice, then you must reject racism and religious bigotry. That is a fundamental principle. But but for those who wants to, view this, must also look at what I've been trying to present in this paper, that the essence of justice has been there and promoted by great scholars like Sheikh Daud Fatani, while talking about prayers in Munyatul Musalli, also make it the point to impart to the public, to the readers and to the students, and in the pondok or pesantren or religious institutions, and to the rulers, the notion of justice, that you cannot be unjust to your citizens. And in that principle must be made clear. So I am not for any sort of positive discrimination. I am for affirmative action, and that's why we have this divide. In my sessions with those urban elite, I always tell them, you criticize the so-called Malay biased policies, but you are completely silent and muted when it comes to the issue of abject poverty in the rural heartland, urban poverty, or even in gross inequality. So you must be clear. It's not a matter of just reaping the benefit of rejecting a so-called affirmative action policy based on race, which I reject. But at the same time, we need friends who understand this and appreciate this to also realize that the so-called Malays that you say having this benefit, the majority of whom are in the abject poor category. So it's more complex than just thinking that the Malay Muslims are getting all the benefit. Who are getting the benefit? It's the ruling clique. The majority of the Malays are in a position of power. So you attack them. Don't attack the Malay masses who remain poor. I presented recently a recent World Bank report looking at the issues of inequality. The position of the Malays as compared to the Chinese have worsened in the last 10 years. Which means the so-called Malay first policy has not benefited the majority of the Malays, but the ruling clique and the Malay elite. At the same time, which is more disconcerting, is a comparison between Malays and ethnic Indians. The ethnic Indians, compared to the Malays who are generally poor, are worse off now than 10 years before. So what do we learn from this? We must embark on a more coherent, transparent policy based on need and not based on race, because it has failed miserably in this country.
I can see, Mo, your camera's on. Do you want to come back on Professor Ibrahim? Is there anything that you'd like to?
Sure. Thank you for responding to this question. It's a very pressing one. But specifically, my issue is that while that situation is very clear, both the World Bank reports and international analysts have pointed out that the Malay population has not improved ever since the new economic policy was introduced in Malaysia for the most part. To this day, the majority of the Malay labor classes, the Malay working classes, support the current political structure, generally speaking, of the Malay elites, who, although being discredited by the 1MDB scandal, continue to resist any sort of deep-seating structural reforms that would move the economy towards something that's more responsive to the needs of individuals, but also support innovative growth in these other kind of important fields. So how do these ideas of reformasi and these ideas that you describe both in the Islamic context and political context based on reform are very strong and powerful. And how do you ultimately convince essentially the Malay working classes, the Malay poor and the rural poor to at least accept or not work with those political ideas to change the society? Because ultimately, as long as they support, the elite system, there will always be a majoritarian government based on, of course, other elected policies that supports the current political.
Well, one clarification. The government now is a minority government, okay? That must be made clear. I think you are quite correct in terms of the general Malay Muslims in the rural areas, in the rural heartland, support the old establishment and the old elite. But the Malays, Muslims, even the urban poor, would support our party and understand better the reform. So I would acknowledge probably our limitations. We need to do more to engage and go down to these villages and the rural heartland to impart this knowledge and understanding, and not just confine ourselves to the urban areas, which fortunately has been our strong bastion for the last 15-20 years. So I think you are right to suggest that we need to do much more and probably more effective, and not to be talking in terms of this some sort of liberal rhetoric about judicial independence and free media and just economic policies in a broad sense, which would appeal to the educated and liberal crowd, but which makes no sense to the poor unless you talk to them about plain bread and butter issues, about their rights in the education and health. And you are right. I mean, I remember when we embarked on this election manifesto, brilliantly crafted by our elites. And of course, the issues are, of course, as I said, alluded to earlier, issue of institutional reform, okay, which is necessary, undeniably so. But then, how do you then craft a manifesto that could be appreciated and understood and relevant to the poor masses? And that has been our challenge, and I concede that this has been probably partly our limitations, that we have to deal with it more effectively than the past.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mois, for your question. Thank you, Professor Ibrahim, for your response. I've got one from Zia, Sardar. Zia asks, can you say a little bit about your experiences in prison? What is it like to be a political prisoner or a prisoner of conscience, and how has this shaped your ideas on justice?
Well, prison is not bed of roses. I always reiterate that point. It's a horrible experience, rotten food, and nasty smell in the cell. You have read all about it in the past. I am not even keen to write about my experience in prison, because I think so much has been written, from Grassi to Mandela, all these years. But what have I learned? Of course I have learned something. I was, a Democrat. I am a practicing Muslim. I believe in justice, therefore transcends race and religion. In the sense of among other faith, we should be fair and just to all, fair. But then when you get to prison, then you realize, as Mark Twain observed, that the vast majority are from the poorer classes. And there's something wrong, systemically rotten in the system, that would continue to allow this prevalence of this state of affairs, with the poor, the marginalized, the downtrodden have to be sent to prison. Partly, to a large extent, of course, they committed some criminal acts, but sometimes very minor. One young guy arrested and remanded already for 6 months for stealing a pair of jeans. And you have leaders squandering hundreds of millions of dollars, being scot-free, or sometimes even promoted or given some honorific titles. And do the judges understand this? Or it's just purely law and not justice? They master the law, but they have no sense of inherent justice. So these are issues that have provoked me to think beyond what I have thought of, understood before. Which means when I talk about freedom, I've tasted unfreedom. When I talked about rule of law, I've tasted a rotten judicial process that ignored all the rudiments of a just rule. When we talk about poverty, you have seen the poverty, the poor, how they're being treated. Now I was badly assaulted when the day I was arrested in 1998. And it became the black eye incident became known in public and internationally known. Fair, but I've seen so many others with a black eye and in the prison, and was just accepted as a normal pattern. But these are people, they are lives. So to Zia's question, what have I learned? I have a better understanding what freedom and justice is all about. Because those who have been badly treated are Muslims Hindus or Buddhists or Christians or enemies. It doesn't matter. But it's a human being being inflicted so much injustice. Even, and I would qualify, when they are deemed to be guilty, but even for a minor crime, the maximum sentence. I saw even foreign workers, this group Indonesians, shouting and just shouting. They call Pak Anwar, how they address in Indonesia, and please help us. Why? Poor workers coming to Malaysia, exploited by the various companies and employees, and then imprisoned and charged, and you have this silly magistrate who would give maximum sentence, 4 strokes and 2-month imprisonment. My God, poor farmers coming to earn a living, cheated by their employers, charged and imprisoned, and whatever they have been taken away from them.
I mean, just as a follow-up, I'm going to invite Zia to come.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm getting a bit more sentimental. I'm sorry. I get a bit disturbed.
I mean, in a way, you prompted a sort of just a follow-up question from me, which is I wonder whether what you're saying, if I could sort of summarize it, is what you're really saying is that justice is only as good as the integrity of the people who are administering it. And so we could have all the best laws in the world and the most just and humane systems, but if those who we make responsible for the administration of justice don't believe in that, or don't trust in it, or are corrupt, then really there's no hope. I mean, that feels like it's a very despondent message that I'm hearing.
Assuming it is just laws, Ehsan, assuming not all laws are just, assuming they are just laws.
If you make that assumption.
Yes, but it's clearly unjust administration of the so-called just laws.
Zia, you're back. Yes.
Yeah, no, I do not think that's a despondent message at all, son. On the contrary, I think it's a very realistic message. Sometimes you have to go through certain experiences to actually appreciate what the real reality is like, and I think the prison experience has transformed Anwar quite considerably. I mean, what I detect now is a much deeper understanding of justice, but also a much more profound appreciation of compassion. And care and compassion is essential part of Anwar Ibrahim's outlook, right? And I don't think it was so strong in the 90s as it is now. It's almost kind of dominant segment of his thought, and I think that has come from the prison experience in a sense. So it's not so much a despondent message; it's much more of a realistic message. It's a message that we face these things, and in fact, his description of what's going on in prison is not just in Malaysia; it's universal. Look at what is going on in the United States, or in most countries, specifically in most Muslim countries, where it's almost part of the system to kind of abuse prisoners, torture them, and so on and so forth. So it does force us to think that perhaps the problems are not just structure, but there's also problems with how we appreciate our own humanity.
I think you have put it succinctly, Zia. We are now calling for effective prison reforms. It's only a small part. And incidentally, my daughter Nuriza has been in the forefront calling for prison reform, because she had been going in and out and looking and listening to me and looking for herself. and some of the prison officers, fortunately, have been quite supportive of this move. But other than that, the more despondent or experience, I have that freedom that I could not find outside. That is to focus and spend hours and hours daily, 8 to 10 hours daily reading, because I had nothing else to do. So if thousands of books, told Zia that I'm a Zia reader, I can comment on any of his writings, and entire works of Shakespeare, copious notes, 5-6 times, and all the classics. Then I can count Indian, Chinese, Arab, English, whatever. So I think there's also this advantage. So my advice to you, those who say that they don't have time to read, they can always have some time in prison to spend more time on reading.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Let's go
Zia.
back to the question. Thank you, Zia. Question from one of our fellows, from Shannon Shah. And Shannon asks, before the present coalition, Pakatan Harapan, there was Pakatan Rakyat, which was another historic coalition that you helped to form in 2008. What are the lessons that you learned then that remain relevant for now?
Well, thank you, Shannon. I've been following your writings in the Critical Muslim, and I'm sure you have this clear understanding of Malaysian politics. But our experience in Pakatan Raya is quite phenomenal. We were able to gather together the Chinese-based, or this multiracial but Chinese-based Democratic Action Party, progressive, and the Islamic Party, which has become somewhat neo-conservative. Issues have been discussed, debated at length, but clearly the Islamic Party leadership find it difficult to join and continue to support a more inclusive, moderate agenda. So they left. So we had to form the new coalition of Hope. Then later on brought in even Mahathir's party, and another casualty, which means between the ideal and reality I've alluded to just now lies a shadow, and sometimes a long shadow. But this is stark reality. In politics, you can maintain your ideals, your idealism, and strong your desire to combat corruption. You're not going to be popular among the ruling elite. The billionaires, the rich tycoons, some I know would spend huge sum of money just to make sure you're defeated. I realized it inside my constituency. Although, alhamdulillah, I won very, very comfortably in the seats that I contested, but you can see the money pouring in to whoever would challenge, and purely because they're so worried about my commitment on reform, on anti-corruption drive, and on transparency. But how do you save this country? Malaysia, Ehsan started off in the beginning, about the 1990s, were relatively much better in development or economic policies, whatever. Although I grant there were limitations, but far better than we are seeing now. But how do you save the country if we do not get governance in place? The problem in Muslim countries basically issue of poor governance and rampant corruption and grinding poverty. These issues are close to my mind, and I think I will not concede. Yes, we are discussing with all parties, but these fundamental principles will not be compromised.
Thank you for that. I don't know, Shannon, whether you want to come on and just have a quick response if you're here, or we can move to the next questions which are now coming in. We've got another 10 minutes. I can see Shannon. Go for it.
I'm having technology problems, so I had to log in from my iPad. But thank you so much for that response, Dato' Sri. I mean, for me, following the events of that time, it was just a roller coaster, because on one hand there was the hope of Pakatan Rakyat and the momentum that it was gaining, But then, as we saw the momentum of Pakatan Rakyat, we also saw the state clamping down on you personally, you know, the charges against you, the second imprisonment. So as a Malaysian, it just feels like every time we're going to get somewhere, you hit a brick wall, and it just feels quite impossible to have that momentum become a sustained, you know, a hope that can grow, a hope that is sustained. So thank you very much for your steadfastness and your thoughtfulness and your drive and your commitment. So that's really inspiring. Thank you.
Well, short note on that, Shannon, because you're right. Because of the series of treachery and inconsistency in some of the moves that we have made, and then of course the departure of some of our friends in the coalition, have caused a growing disillusionment. You know, it's also international phenomena. The people are getting more disillusioned about politics and politicians. And this is, of course, to my mind, very worrying, because if this creeps into the sentiments of the youth, then you will just allow the most corrupt, decadent elements to continue with impunity and without scrutiny. So I will appeal to them, look, you should continue and demand that we introduce and we support politicians with core values and principles, and clear principles and position vis-a-vis governance and anti-corruption drive.
Thank you so much for that. We are literally at the sort of limit of our time. I'm just going to ask you just one final question, Professor Ibrahim, and this is really about the next year and beyond, and just going back to the theme of the pandemic. I mean, it really has changed so many things in ways that I think we're only beginning to understand. Some things will perhaps be the same, and many things will not be the same. What's your own prognosis about how societies will be different if and, well, hopefully when we come out of the virus?
Well, of course, technology will benefit from this. I think Zoom and technology much more than previously. But I think looking at people on the ground, in the villages, people tend to become more independent and resilient. Of course, there are terrible hardships. As I said to you, we have crossed 800,000 unemployment, 16-17% graduate unemployment, which has been unprecedented in this country. But I would think I'm more optimistic. I think we should be able to resolve this by next year. I mean, come what may, there will be some lingering remnants of the problem, but notwithstanding that, I think we have seen, for example, this, as I said, resilience of people saying that we have to survive. We cannot be just totally dependent on governments and handouts. We have to try and create. There are hundreds or thousands of new initiatives. People are just trying to survive. You have pilots as Grab drivers, or engineers as stall keeper, whatever, you know. I'm not suggesting that this is acceptable, but people have to survive. And I think this sort of a resilience probably is required, and I think to embark and affect a meaningful change and reform in this country.
Thank you very much for that response. We have come to the end of this event. Thank you, Professor Ibrahim, for staying late, and for also for breaking for doing iftar with us on camera. So obviously it's been a long day for you, and we've actually prolonged it even more. Thanks to all the participants. Please, for those of you who are not members of the Muslim Institutes, please go to musliminstitute.org where you can see and learn all about the organisation. Please subscribe to Critical Muslim, which is themed around the coronavirus in its latest issue.